At 28, I thought I understood betrayal. I thought I knew what it meant to have someone you love turn your words into weapons against you. But sitting in that sterile courtroom in Riverside County, watching David Chen adjust his perfectly pressed tie while his lawyer shuffled through a folder thick with lies about my mental state, I realized I had been naive about the depths people would sink to when they wanted to win. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like angry wasps, casting everything in that harsh courtroom glow that makes everyone look guilty of something. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. David sat 3 tables away from me, close enough that I could smell his cologne, the same one he'd worn on our first date 7 years ago, when he'd promised me forever felt too short for what he wanted to give me. Now he wouldn't meet my eyes, wouldn't acknowledge that the woman he was systematically destroying had once been the person he'd begged to marry him. His new girlfriend Ashley sat behind him in the gallery, her manicured nails drumming silently against her Hermes bag. She was everything I wasn't anymore, everything I couldn't afford to be since the divorce had left me working double shifts at the community health center, just to afford my 1-bedroom apartment in Moreno Valley. Where I clipped coupons and bought Emma's clothes at Target, Ashley wore designer everything and lived in David's new house in Corona Hills, the one with the swimming pool and the 3-car garage that he'd somehow managed to afford on the same salary that had supposedly left us struggling when we were married. My lawyer Marcus Williams was good, but he wasn't expensive good. He was legal aid good, hardworking public servant good, the kind of lawyer who believed in justice, but had to fight for it with budget office supplies and borrowed time. Across the aisle, Jennifer Park commanded the courtroom like she owned it, her briefcase probably worth more than my monthly rent, her confidence the kind that money buys and keeps polished. But none of that mattered when Judge Patricia Brennan called the court to order and I saw Emma in the hallway through the glass doors, sitting next to my sister Lisa, her small legs swinging from the wooden bench, her face pressed against the window, trying to understand why Mommy and Daddy had to talk to the serious people in black robes about where she would sleep at night. 8 years old and already learning that love doesn't protect you from the legal system, that adults can take the most precious thing in your world and turn it into a battle strategy. The case had started simple enough. Standard custody arrangement, 50-50 split, the kind of thing that happens every day in family courts across America. But David had wanted more. He'd wanted primary custody, wanted to reduce my time with Emma to supervised visits, wanted to paint me as an unfit mother who posed a danger to our daughter's well-being. And his strategy was as calculated as it was cruel. He was going to use my own words against me, twist every moment of vulnerability I'd shared with him during our marriage into evidence of my alleged instability. David's testimony had started 3 hours earlier, and he'd painted a picture of me that was technically true but completely dishonest. Yes, I had struggled with anxiety after Emma was born. Yes, I had seen a therapist for postpartum depression. Yes, there had been nights when the weight of new motherhood had felt overwhelming, and I'd cried in our bedroom while he worked late again, leaving me alone with a colicky baby and a mind that wouldn't stop spinning with worst-case scenarios. But he'd forgotten to mention how he'd held me through those panic attacks, how he'd promised me that seeking help was brave, how he'd driven me to therapy appointments and told me he was proud of me for fighting for my mental health. He'd conveniently omitted the part where he'd encouraged me to document my feelings in a journal, said it would help with therapy, said it was important to be honest about the hard parts of motherhood. He'd forgotten to tell the court how he'd read that journal sometimes, how I'd shared my deepest fears with him, because I trusted him completely. Now those journal entries were Exhibit A through G in his case against me. Private thoughts about feeling overwhelmed became evidence of my inability to cope. Honest admissions about the challenges of balancing work and motherhood became proof of my instability. Raw, vulnerable moments where I'd questioned whether I was good enough for Emma became ammunition in his fight to take her away from me. Jennifer Park read from my own handwriting with the clinical detachment of a surgeon making incisions. February 15th, 2022. I don't know if I'm cut out for this. Emma cried for 3 hours straight today, and nothing I did helped. I keep thinking about how my mom made it look so easy, how she never seemed to doubt herself the way I doubt every decision I make. What if I'm damaging her? What if she'd be better off with someone who actually knows what they're doing? The words hung in the courtroom air like smoke, and I watched the judge's expression shift slightly, saw her make a note. Out of context, Stripped of the love and exhaustion and honesty that had prompted them, my own thoughts became evidence against me. Jennifer Park didn't mention that the entry was from the height of Emma's teething phase, when no parent in history had ever felt confident. She didn't read the entries from the weeks that followed, when I'd written about breakthrough moments, about Emma's first real smile, about how much I loved being her mother despite the challenges. Mrs. Chen, Jennifer Park continued, using my married name like a weapon. These journal entries span nearly 2 years of documented emotional instability. In your professional opinion, Mr. Chen, did you ever feel that your wife's mental state posed a risk to your daughter's well-being? David shifted in his seat, finally looking in my direction, and for just a moment I saw something flicker across his face. Guilt, maybe, or regret, but it passed quickly, replaced by the cold determination of someone who'd already decided that winning mattered more than truth. I was concerned, he said slowly, his voice carrying just the right note of reluctant honesty. Sarah has always been an anxious person, but after Emma was born, it got worse. There were times when I'd come home from work and find her crying, unable to explain why. Times when she'd wake up in the middle of the night convinced that something terrible was going to happen to Emma, checking on her compulsively. He wasn't lying, not exactly, but he was telling the story without context, without mentioning that new parent anxiety was normal, that I'd been working with a therapist, that I'd never once put Emma in danger or shown any signs of being unable to care for her. He made it sound like I was falling apart, when the truth was that I was doing everything right, seeking help when I needed it, being honest about my struggles instead of pretending to be perfect. And did there come a time when you felt you needed to document these concerns? Jennifer Park prompted. Yes, David said, pulling out his phone. I started taking notes when Sarah's behavior became more erratic. I felt like I needed to keep track of incidents in case. He paused, the perfect picture of a concerned father forced to make difficult decisions. In case something happened, and I needed to protect Emma. My stomach dropped as I realized what was coming. While I'd been documenting my feelings in a private journal as part of my therapy process, David had been building a case against me. Every moment of vulnerability had been recorded, cataloged, and saved for this exact moment. Every time I'd struggled with the normal challenges of new motherhood, he'd been making notes like I was a subject under observation rather than his wife going through a difficult time. Marcus Williams objected when Jennifer Park tried to introduce David's documentation as evidence, arguing that private notes taken without my knowledge couldn't be authenticated or verified for accuracy. But the damage was already done. The suggestion had been planted that my own husband had felt the need to monitor and document my behavior because he feared for our daughter's safety. The afternoon stretched on with a parade of character witnesses for David's side. Ashley Romano testified about how stable and nurturing David's home environment was, how Emma always seemed happy and well-adjusted after spending time there. David's mother spoke about her concerns for Emma's well-being, though she was careful to frame her testimony as worry about me rather than direct criticism. His boss testified to David's reliability and strong character, his community involvement, his dedication to providing for his family. Each witness added another layer to the picture they were painting. David as the stable, reliable parent, me as the liability. They spoke about Emma's behavior after visits with me, claiming she seemed anxious or upset, though they couldn't provide specific examples beyond vague assertions that she wasn't herself or seemed worried about something. It was death by 1,000 tiny cuts, each testimony individually insignificant, but collectively. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Collectively devastating. But the worst part wasn't the lies or the exaggerations, or the way they twisted normal parental concern into evidence of unfitness. The worst part was watching David nod along with all of it, seeing him validate assessments of my character that he knew weren't true. This was the man who'd seen me at my most vulnerable and promised to love me through anything. This was the father of my child, someone who'd once told me I was the strongest person he knew, that Emma was lucky to have me as her mother. Now he sat silent, while his lawyer and witnesses painted me as unstable, unreliable, potentially dangerous. He watched them take my honesty about struggling with new motherhood and turn it into evidence that I was unfit to parent. He let them use my journal entries, thoughts I'd shared with him in confidence during the hardest period of my life, as weapons against me in a fight for our daughter. When the court recessed for the day, I sat in my car in the parking lot for 20 minutes before I could trust myself to drive. My hands were shaking, not from anxiety but from rage, from the sheer audacity of what I'd just witnessed. David had taken every private conversation we'd ever had about my fears and insecurities and weaponized them. He'd documented my struggles like a researcher studying a subject rather than a husband supporting his wife. That night, Emma was with David per the temporary custody arrangement, sleeping in her new bedroom in Corona Hills while I sat alone in my apartment in Moreno Valley, staring at my phone and wondering if I should call Dr. Rebecca Torres. She'd been Emma's pediatric psychologist during a brief period when Emma had needed help processing our separation, and she'd gotten to know both of us well during that time. But asking her to testify felt like crossing a line, like dragging a professional who'd helped my daughter into the ugly reality of my divorce. But as I thought about David's testimony, about the way he'd twisted my honesty into evidence against me, I realized that sometimes crossing lines becomes necessary when someone else has already burned down all the boundaries. If David wanted to make this about my fitness as a mother, then I needed someone who'd actually observed me parenting, someone who could speak to the reality of my relationship with Emma rather than the fiction he was constructing. Dr. Torres agreed to testify, but her tone was careful, professional. She couldn't advocate for me directly, she explained, but she could speak to her observations during our sessions, to Emma's well-being and behavior, to the therapeutic work we'd done together. It wasn't much, but it was something. A single voice of professional authority in a chorus of David's carefully selected character witnesses. The next morning I woke up before my alarm, anxiety sitting heavy in my chest like a stone. Today would be my turn to present my case, to try to rebuild my reputation after David had spent yesterday systematically destroying it. I dressed carefully in my best suit, the navy one I'd bought for job interviews back when I still thought fairness existed in the world, when I believed that truth would always win out over strategy. Marcus Williams met me at the courthouse steps, his expression grim but determined. He'd spent the previous evening preparing our witnesses, coaching them on how to present their testimony effectively, how to counter the narrative that David's team had constructed. My mother Carol would testify about my relationship with Emma, about the mother she'd observed me become. My sister Lisa would speak to my character, to the person she'd known her entire life. But I knew it wouldn't be enough. Character witnesses were one thing, but David had documentation, journals, notes, the appearance of objective evidence. He had money and expensive lawyers, and a narrative that fit neatly into society's fears about mental health and motherhood. I had love and truth, and a legal aid lawyer who believed in me, but couldn't afford the kind of expert witnesses that might have made a difference. As we walked into the courthouse, I caught a glimpse of Emma in the hallway again, still sitting with Lisa, still watching through the glass doors with the patient attention of a child who'd learned too young that adult conversations determine the shape of your world. She waved at me through the glass, and I waved back, hoping my smile looked more confident than it felt. Because tomorrow, when Dr. Rebecca Torres took the stand, everything would change. I just didn't know it yet. The morning Dr. Rebecca Torres was scheduled to testify, I arrived at the courthouse 2 hours early. I sat in my car watching the sunrise paint the building's concrete facade in shades of gold and amber, trying to calm the nervous energy that had kept me awake most of the night. This was it, my last real chance to counter the narrative David had so carefully constructed, to show the court who I really was as a mother, rather than the distorted version his expensive legal team had presented. Dr. Torres arrived precisely at 8:30, her professional composure evident even from across the parking lot. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who spent her days helping families navigate their most difficult moments, someone who understood that the truth often lived in the spaces between what people said and what they meant. As she walked toward the courthouse entrance, I felt a flicker of hope for the first time in weeks. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere felt different from the previous day. David seemed more tense, his usual controlled demeanor showing small cracks around the edges. Ashley fidgeted with her jewelry more than usual, and even Jennifer Park appeared slightly less certain as she reviewed her notes. They knew that Dr. Torres represented something they couldn't easily dismiss or discredit, a professional opinion based on actual observation, rather than strategic storytelling. Judge Brennan called the court to order with the same measured authority she'd shown throughout the proceedings, but I noticed her gaze linger on Dr. Torres as Marcus Williams called her to the stand. The bailiff administered the oath with practiced efficiency, and Dr. Torres settled into the witness chair with the calm presence of someone who'd testified in family court dozens of times before. Marcus began with the standard foundation questions, establishing Dr. Torres's credentials and her professional relationship with our family. She spoke clearly about her doctorate in child psychology, her specialization in family therapy, her 15 years of experience working with children in crisis situations. The judge took notes as Dr. Torres outlined her work with Emma during the initial separation period, explaining how she'd come to observe both David and me during that difficult time. Dr. Torres, Marcus continued, during your therapeutic work with Emma Chen Mitchell, did you have the opportunity to observe her interactions with both parents? Yes, I did. As part of my assessment process, I conducted several family sessions that included Emma with each parent individually, as well as some joint sessions. I also had the opportunity to observe pickup and drop-off interactions over the course of approximately 3 months. And what was the nature of your observations regarding the mother-child relationship between Sarah Mitchell and Emma? Dr. Torres paused thoughtfully, the way she always did when choosing her words carefully. I observed a strong, healthy attachment between Sarah and Emma. Their interactions were characterized by genuine affection, appropriate boundaries, and clear communication. Emma consistently sought comfort from her mother during stressful moments and showed obvious joy during their time together. Jennifer Park rose slightly in her seat, clearly preparing to object, but Dr. Torres continued before the interruption could take hold. More specifically, I observed Sarah demonstrating what we call attentive parenting. She was responsive to Emma's emotional needs, consistent in her approach to discipline, and showed excellent awareness of her daughter's developmental needs. During our sessions, Emma frequently referenced activities she enjoyed with her mother, stories Sarah had read to her, conversations they'd had about the divorce that showed age-appropriate honesty and emotional support. Marcus nodded, allowing the testimony to settle before continuing. Dr. Torres, are you familiar with the allegations that have been made regarding Sarah Mitchell's mental health and its potential impact on her parenting? I am aware of those allegations, yes. In your professional opinion, based on your direct observations, do you have concerns about Sarah Mitchell's ability to provide a safe, stable environment for her daughter? Dr. Torres looked directly at the judge as she answered, her voice carrying the weight of professional certainty. No, I do not. In fact, I observed quite the opposite. Sarah Mitchell demonstrated remarkable emotional intelligence throughout our sessions. When Emma expressed confusion or sadness about the divorce, Sarah validated those feelings while providing reassurance and age-appropriate explanations. She never spoke negatively about Emma's father in front of the child, despite what was clearly a difficult personal situation. She paused, consulting her notes briefly before continuing. I should note that seeking mental health support, as Ms. Mitchell did during the postpartum period, is actually an indicator of good parenting rather than poor parenting. Parents who recognize when they need help and actively seek professional support are demonstrating responsibility for their own well-being and, by extension, their child's well-being. I watched David's face as Dr. Torres spoke, saw his jaw tighten with each observation that contradicted his narrative. Ashley had stopped fidgeting entirely, sitting frozen in her seat as if movement might somehow make the testimony worse. Jennifer Park scribbled notes furiously, clearly preparing for cross-examination. Marcus guided Dr. Torres through several more questions, establishing that Emma had never shown signs of anxiety or distress related to spending time with me, that the child had consistently expressed love and attachment to both parents, and that her emotional development was progressing normally despite the family upheaval. Dr. Torres, in your experience working with families in crisis, have you observed situations where one parent attempts to manipulate the legal system by misrepresenting the other parent's mental health? Jennifer Park shot to her feet. Objection, Your Honor, leading the witness. Sustained, Judge Brennan replied, but her expression suggested the question had made its intended impact. Marcus rephrased. Dr. Torres, can you speak to your observations about the family dynamics you witnessed during your work with this family? Dr. Torres considered her answer carefully. I observed some concerning patterns during joint sessions. There were instances where I noted what appeared to be emotional manipulation, attempts to control the narrative about family events, and a tendency to minimize the other parent's contributions to Emma's well-being. However, these behaviors were not coming from the direction one might expect based on the current allegations. The courtroom fell silent except for the soft scratch of the court reporter's fingers on her machine. Dr. Torres had just called David out without naming him directly, her professional language making the accusation even more damning than a direct confrontation would have been. Can you elaborate on that observation, Dr. Torres? During family sessions, I observed patterns consistent with what we term emotional invalidation. One parent would systematically dismiss or minimize the other parent's emotional experiences, particularly around the challenges of new parenthood. When the mother expressed normal concerns about parenting decisions or sought validation for her efforts, these concerns were often reframed as evidence of instability rather than normal parental anxiety. Jennifer Park was on her feet again. Objection, Your Honor. The witness is offering opinions beyond her scope of observation. Overruled. The witness is qualified to offer professional opinions based on her direct observations. Continue, Dr. Torres. I also observed what appeared to be gaslighting behaviors, instances where one parent would suggest that the other parent's recollection of events was incorrect, or that their emotional responses were inappropriate or exaggerated. This created a dynamic where the targeted parent began to doubt their own perceptions and experiences. Dr. Torres glanced at her notes again before delivering what would become the most crucial part of her testimony. In my professional opinion, these dynamics were far more concerning for Emma's well-being than any mental health challenges her mother was addressing through appropriate therapeutic channels. Marcus asked a few more questions about Emma's current emotional state and her expressed preferences about custody arrangements, but the foundation had already been laid. Dr. Torres had systematically dismantled David's case not by attacking him directly, but by providing professional context for everything he'd presented as evidence of my unfitness. When Jennifer Park rose for cross-examination, her usual confidence seemed forced. She began with standard attempts to undermine Dr. Torres's observations, suggesting that therapeutic settings don't reflect real-world parenting situations, that children often behave differently in clinical environments than they do at home. Dr. Torres responded to each question with patience and precision, explaining that her observations included home visits, that she'd specifically designed her assessment process to capture authentic family interactions, that her conclusions were based on multiple observation points over an extended period. Dr. Torres, Jennifer Park said, shifting tactics, are you testifying that Sarah Mitchell has no mental health challenges whatsoever? No, that's not what I'm testifying. I'm testifying that having mental health challenges and addressing them appropriately through professional support is not the same as being an unfit parent. In fact, parents who model healthy, help-seeking behavior often raise children who are better equipped to handle their own emotional challenges. But surely you would agree that a parent's mental health can impact their ability to provide stable care for a child? Absolutely. Untreated mental health issues can definitely impact parenting. However, treated mental health issues, particularly when the parent is actively engaged in therapy and showing positive outcomes, often result in more emotionally intelligent and empathetic parenting. Jennifer Park tried several more approaches, attempting to get Dr. Torres to acknowledge that anxiety or depression automatically made someone a less capable parent, that journaling about negative emotions was concerning, that seeking therapy was itself evidence of serious problems. Each time, Dr. Torres calmly explained the difference between struggling and failing, between seeking help and being helpless, between honest self-reflection and actual instability. The cross-examination dragged on for nearly an hour, but Jennifer Park never managed to shake Dr. Torres's professional composure or her conclusions. If anything, the aggressive questioning only served to highlight the contrast between evidence-based professional assessment and the character assassination that had characterized David's case. When Dr. Torres finally stepped down from the witness stand, the energy in the courtroom had shifted completely. David's expensive legal strategy suddenly looked exactly like what it was: a calculated attempt to manipulate the system rather than a genuine concern for Emma's well-being. Marcus called my mother Carol to testify next, and she spoke with quiet dignity about the grandmother she'd observed me become, about Emma's obvious comfort and happiness during their time together, about the countless ways she'd watched me prioritize my daughter's needs over my own comfort during the difficult months of separation and divorce. My sister Lisa followed, describing family gatherings where Emma consistently sought me out for comfort, where the child's face lit up when I entered a room, where the bond between mother and daughter was obvious to anyone who cared to look. She spoke about late-night phone calls where I'd worried about making the right decisions for Emma, about my dedication to maintaining stability and routine despite the upheaval in our lives. But it was when Marcus called me to testify on my own behalf that everything truly came together. I dreaded this moment for weeks, terrified that my own words would be twisted against me the way my journal entries had been. But Dr. Torres's testimony had changed something fundamental about the courtroom atmosphere, had reframed my honesty about mental health challenges as strength rather than weakness. I spoke about the early months of Emma's life, about the overwhelming love and equally overwhelming responsibility I'd felt as a new mother. I acknowledged my struggles with anxiety and depression, but I contextualized them within the broader story of learning to parent, of growing into the role of motherhood, of doing everything possible to be the best mother I could be for Emma. I talked about my decision to seek therapy, explaining that it had been motivated by love for my daughter rather than any inability to care for her. I described the tools I'd learned in therapy, the ways I'd grown as a person and as a parent, the strength I'd found in being honest about my challenges rather than pretending they didn't exist. When Jennifer Park cross-examined me, she tried to use my own journal entries against me again, reading passages out of context and asking me to explain my concerning thoughts and feelings. But this time, I was ready for her tactics. "Miss Park," I said when she finished reading a particularly vulnerable entry about feeling overwhelmed, "that journal entry was written during the worst week of Emma's teething phase, when she was sleeping 2 hours at a time and crying most of the day. I was exhausted, I was worried about her discomfort, and I was questioning whether I was doing enough to help her. But if you read the entry from 3 days later, which you didn't include in your question, you'll see that I wrote about how proud I was when we finally found a teething remedy that worked, how grateful I was for my mother's advice, and how much I loved watching Emma smile again." I looked directly at Judge Brennan as I continued. Those journal entries weren't evidence of instability. They were evidence of a mother who cared so much about doing right by her daughter that she documented her struggles in order to work through them in therapy. They were evidence of someone who refused to pretend that parenting was easy, because I believed that honesty would make me a better mother. Jennifer Park tried to paint my honesty as evidence of poor judgment, but her questions began to sound increasingly desperate. Why had I written down negative thoughts instead of keeping them private? Why had I sought therapy instead of handling my challenges independently? Why had I been so open with David about my struggles instead of maintaining a facade of perfect competence? "Because," I answered, my voice growing stronger with each question, "I thought I was married to someone who loved me enough to support me through difficult times. I thought I was sharing my vulnerabilities with a partner who wanted to help me grow and heal. I never imagined that my honesty would someday be used as ammunition against me in a custody battle." The silence that followed felt different from the other pauses in the proceedings. This wasn't the silence of people processing information. This was the silence of people recognizing a fundamental truth about betrayal and manipulation. Judge Brennan called a brief recess after my testimony concluded, and I sat in the hallway with Marcus, emotionally drained but cautiously hopeful. Dr. Torres found us during the break, offering a brief nod of encouragement before disappearing back into the courthouse. Emma was no longer visible through the glass doors, probably taken somewhere more comfortable to wait while the adults continued their formal battle over her future. When court reconvened for closing arguments, Jennifer Park did her best to salvage David's case, arguing that mental health documentation and professional concerns couldn't be dismissed simply because they were inconvenient. She painted David as a protective father forced to make difficult decisions, suggested that my therapeutic progress was recent and potentially temporary, insisted that Emma's best interests required the stability that only David's household could provide. But her arguments sounded hollow after Dr. Torres's testimony, like someone trying to convince people that black was white when they could clearly see the colors for themselves. The professional opinion of a qualified child psychologist carried more weight than strategic interpretation of private journal entries, and Jennifer Park knew it. Marcus's closing argument was powerful in its simplicity. He reminded the court that seeking mental health treatment was a sign of responsibility, not irresponsibility. He pointed out that every professional who'd observed my actual parenting had concluded that Emma was thriving in my care. He noted that the only concerns about my fitness as a mother came from someone with a clear financial and personal motive to discredit me. Your Honor, Marcus concluded, this case isn't really about mental health or parenting capacity. It's about a man who decided that destroying his ex-wife's reputation was easier than sharing custody of his daughter. The evidence shows that Emma Chen Mitchell has two loving parents, both capable of providing excellent care. The question is whether this court will reward manipulation and character assassination, or whether it will make decisions based on the actual evidence about what's best for this child. Judge Brennan announced that she would take the matter under advisement and issue her ruling within a week. As the courtroom emptied, David finally looked directly at me for the first time since the proceedings began. Whatever he saw in my face made him look away quickly, his expression unreadable. 3 days later, Marcus called me at work with news that would change everything. Judge Brennan had issued her ruling, and not only had she maintained the 50-50 custody arrangement David had tried to overturn, she'd also issued a formal reprimand about the misuse of mental health information in custody proceedings. She wrote a 10-page opinion, Marcus told me, his voice carrying a smile I could hear through the phone. She specifically noted Dr. Torres's testimony and criticized the weaponization of therapy records. She said that parents who seek appropriate mental health treatment should be commended, not penalized, and that the court won't tolerate attempts to manipulate the system through character assassination. More importantly, Judge Brennan had ordered that David pay my legal fees, finding that his baseless attempts to modify custody had been frivolous and motivated by spite rather than genuine concern for Emma's well-being. The financial burden that had been crushing me for months was suddenly lifted, replaced by a court-ordered acknowledgement that I'd been the victim rather than the problem. That evening, I picked Emma up from David's house for our regularly scheduled time together. She ran to me with the same enthusiasm she always showed, wrapping her arms around my waist and chattering about her day at school. David handed over her backpack with minimal conversation, but I caught him watching us through the window as we drove away. Later that week, Dr. Torres sent me a brief email congratulating me on the outcome and noting that Emma seemed particularly happy and settled during their final session together. She mentioned that she'd written a summary of her observations for my records, in case they were ever needed again, and included a line that made me cry with relief and gratitude. Emma is fortunate to have a mother who loves her enough to fight for the truth. The following month, I received an unexpected call from a local family advocacy organization. They'd heard about Judge Brennan's ruling and were interested in discussing whether I'd be willing to share my experience with other parents facing similar situations. The idea of speaking publicly about something so personal was terrifying, but I thought about all the other mothers who might be sitting in courtrooms right now, watching their own words be twisted against them, feeling helpless against expensive lawyers and strategic character assassination. I agreed to speak at their next support group meeting, and that small gathering led to an invitation to share my story at a larger conference on family court reform. Standing at that podium, looking out at a room full of legal professionals, advocates, and parents who'd lived through their own custody battles, I felt something I hadn't experienced since this whole ordeal began: the power of truth spoken in the right context to the right audience. I talked about the difference between struggling and failing, between seeking help and being helpless, between honest self-reflection and actual unfitness. I spoke about Dr. Torres's testimony and how professional expertise had cut through the manipulation and strategic storytelling that had characterized David's case. I shared Judge Brennan's ruling and the precedent it might set for other families facing similar attacks. But mostly, I talked about Emma, about the little girl who deserved to have both her parents focused on her well-being, rather than their own wounded egos. who needed to see that adults could fight for truth without destroying each other in the process, who should never have to learn that love can be weaponized in legal proceedings. 6 months after the custody hearing ended, Emma and I were having dinner at our favorite restaurant when she asked me a question that stopped me cold. "Mommy, why did Daddy try to say you were sick when you weren't?" I put down my fork and looked at my daughter, this brilliant, perceptive child who'd been watching and listening to more than I'd realized. "Sometimes adults make mistakes when they're scared or angry," I told her carefully. "Daddy was worried about sharing time with you, and he thought if he could prove I wasn't a good mommy, he could have more time with you for himself. But Dr. Torres told the truth about you," Emma said matter-of-factly. "She said you were a good mommy, and that I was lucky to have you." "Yes, she did tell the truth. And the judge believed her because she's a professional who knows about families and kids." Emma nodded seriously, then brightened. "I'm glad the judge was smart. I would be sad if I couldn't live with you anymore." As we finished dinner, I thought about how different my life looked now compared to those dark days in the courthouse. Emma was thriving, spending equal time with both parents, secure in the knowledge that she was loved and wanted by both of us. David had eventually stopped trying to manipulate the situation, perhaps finally understanding that his daughter's well-being was more important than his wounded pride. I'd kept my job at the community health center, but I'd also started volunteering with the family advocacy organization, helping other parents navigate custody disputes and understand their rights. Dr. Torres had become not just Emma's former therapist, but a professional colleague, someone I consulted with when my advocacy work brought me into contact with particularly complex family situations. The journal I'd once kept private was now part of a larger conversation about mental health and parenting, included in presentations about the importance of seeking help when you need it, and the danger of stigmatizing parents who are honest about their struggles. Those vulnerable words that David had tried to use against me had become tools for helping other families. Evidence that strength often looks like admitting you don't have all the answers. But perhaps the most important change was the relationship I'd built with truth itself. I no longer feared my own honesty or worried that vulnerability would be used against me. I'd learned that the right people, the people worth having in your life, will support your efforts to grow and heal rather than weaponize your struggles for their own advantage. Standing in my kitchen that evening, helping Emma with homework while dinner cooked on the stove, I realized that David's attempt to destroy my reputation had actually accomplished something he'd never intended. It had forced me to find my voice, to speak my truth in public forums, to become an advocate for other families facing similar challenges. The woman who'd sat terrified in that courtroom, watching her private thoughts be twisted into evidence against her, had become someone who could stand on stages and speak truth to power, who could help other parents understand their rights and find their strength. The experience that was meant to silence me had actually taught me the power of speaking up, not just for myself but for everyone who'd ever been told their honesty was a weakness instead of a strength. Emma finished her math homework and looked up at me with the serious expression she wore when she was thinking about big concepts. "Mommy, I'm proud of you for fighting for the truth." "Thank you, sweetheart. I'm proud of you for being so understanding about everything." "Dr. Torres was right," Emma said, gathering her books. "I am lucky to have you as my mommy." As I tucked her into bed that night, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this moment. From the nightmare of false accusations and legal manipulation, to the vindication of professional testimony and judicial wisdom. From the terror of potentially losing my daughter, to the strength of helping other families avoid similar trauma. David had tried to make me disappear from Emma's life by painting me as unstable and unfit. Instead, he'd helped me discover a strength I didn't know I possessed, a voice I'd never thought to use, and a purpose that extended far beyond our private family drama. The woman he'd tried to destroy had become someone who could help other mothers find their own power, who could speak truth in courtrooms and conference rooms with equal authority. The last thing I thought about before falling asleep was Dr. Torres taking the stand, her calm professional voice cutting through all the manipulation and strategic storytelling to say simply what she'd observed. A good mother doing her best for her daughter, seeking help when she needed it, growing stronger through the process of facing her challenges honestly. Sometimes the people who try to tear you down end up giving you exactly what you need to build yourself up stronger than before. Sometimes their weapons become your tools. Their attacks become your armor. Their attempts to silence you become the very reason you find your voice. And sometimes, when you're finally standing in the truth of who you are, rather than the distortion of who someone else tried to make you seem, you realize that the fight was worth it not just for yourself, but for everyone who will benefit from the strength you discovered in the process of defending your right to be human, imperfect, honest, and still worthy of love. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.